Today we have cameras that can practically shoot in the dark. We can crank up the ISO sensitivity to amazing levels and maintain crisp images. Focusing from entry-level cameras through professional behemoths is incredible. Today's cameras, they're just super fast overall, and I can't remember the last time I heard any debates about shutter lag or ridiculously small buffers, either in mirrorless or DSLR configurations. At this point, it seems to me that the question is, what do you want to use? And if you're like me, and you do need those fancy DSLRs for working and some of my own personal photography goals, but you also want to be able to pick up a camera and simply enjoy yourself, what do you choose? This review is not going to be a technical deep dive of this Fuji X100F, and it's not going head-to-head against my trusty D500, D810, or even the Canon Rebel SL2. That's not to say that I won't have videos where I walk through the X100F menus and various settings. I certainly will. And I'll address some of the features here, but the most important aspect of this review is that I give you a sense of how this camera can fit into your everyday life, how it's fit into my everyday life, from my own unique perspective as primarily a DSLR user. Now, don't be fooled by the simplicity of my review. It's how I choose to use this camera. It's simple. Let me give you an example. This camera has 7 function buttons, and there are 4 pages of options for each function button. It's a crazy amount of flexibility in such a small package. The way that I use this camera, it's all about the basics, and I think that's truly where it shines. First, let's do a little bit of a body tour. Sometimes I do that in a video entirely separate from my review, but as far as I'm concerned, with the X100F body, the body really is the star of the show. It's very solidly built, and the dials inspire confidence. Frankly, I've never imagined myself saying things about a camera like the dials inspire confidence, but here I am saying it, and I mean it. I fiddled with the Nikon DF a long time ago, which it just never seemed to fully embrace its inner analogness. And I do pick up my Nikon FG from time to time, which doesn't have an inner digitalness to embrace. When it comes to combining old school feeling and features with 2018 technology, the X100F really hits the sweet spot for me. The X100F is compact, but also substantial. Let's say that it has a certain density to it, which exudes build quality. I'm not saying to throw it around or anything, but there's no cheap plastic feel here, and it's super easy to hold. Let's first talk about the top plate of the camera. Here's one of the function buttons. I'm just tapping the potential of these because I've been focused on the dials. And here are the dials. There's exposure compensation, ISO, and shutter speed. They're all very easy to use with deep textures on the dials, which make it easy to grab and turn. These dials on the Fuji, they've got grip. They're easy to turn with that kind of satisfying positive click response when you are turning the dial. And there's a hot shoe here. I haven't used it yet. And then there's nothing to the left of the hot shoe. It's super clean, classic design. Originally, I had the neck strap on the camera, and it does come with one, but for a camera this small and maneuverable, I wanted to try a wrist strap, which is actually a first for me, and I haven't looked back. When it's on my wrist, it's kind of always ready for action, and this camera loves to be ready in your hand. The back of the camera brings the digital side of the camera to life. The joystick on the back for setting focus area is fast and responsive. It's very similar to the one I've used on the Nikon D500 and the Nikon D850. The menus and screens themselves are not overly crowded with information. It's fairly intuitive. And coming from other brands, I felt like I kind of already knew how to use at least 90% of the functions. I didn't feel like I really needed to do a straight read-through of the manual before I started using the camera, but I've certainly looked a few things up in the manual, especially for some of the options used for setting your manual focusing preferences. I do like that the menus go a page at a time, and I never felt lost. Everything seems to be arranged in a way that the features are kept in context with one another. There's a Q button on the back that gets you directly to many of the commonly used menu items for working in a hurry, when you need to kind of go beyond aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and exposure compensation. The front of the camera has a couple of items, and wait for it, aperture control right on the lens. It's old school and I love it. This switch here, the quick change between optical and electronic viewfinder, because why choose just one when you have ready access to both? Now, I could make an entire video about choosing one of the viewfinder options over the other. I will say this now. The optical viewfinder lets you work minimally. It does give you framing lines so that you understand what portion of the view is being captured. This comes into play especially when working close up, and there's a parallax correction focusing indicator that helps you out. If you like the look of an optical viewfinder, it's all here. If you like plenty of data, you can put it on there. If you don't, you can just make it more minimal. With the electronic viewfinder, what you see is what you get. And it's a duplicate of everything that you can do with the rear display, but in the viewfinder. It's also great for image review or using image review, at least in bright situations, when you want to focus on what the camera is telling you and kind of shut out distractions. And as you've had with previous incarnations of the X100 series, you can put a small electronic viewfinder in the lower right-hand corner of the optical viewfinder. Depending on how you look at it, it's either the best of both worlds or it's trying to do two things at once when one method at a time will suffice. I don't know. We'll chalk the final answer on that to personal preference. And I'll say that I do like having the choice. Frankly, I thought I'd be using the optical viewfinder all of the time, but due to the quality of the electronic viewfinder and using it effectively as a preview for the film simulation modes, I find myself leaning on the electronic viewfinder more and more as I keep using the camera. Oh yes, the lens. 23mm f2. Because this is an APS-C cropped sensor camera, you're looking at a 35mm field of view equivalent of 35 millimeters. What's funny is in the past couple of years, I found myself shooting full frame with my 35mm lens and my cropped sensor D500 with my 24mm lens. So having the 35mm equivalent on this camera felt very natural to me. There are two attachable lenses available that do piggyback onto this one. One is wide and the other is a mild telephoto. I haven't used them. I'm not sure how I feel about them yet. For me, this camera is primarily about having the one focal length and just sticking with it. That debate that I always have with my DSLRs about which lens or lenses to run out the door with, there's just no debate with the X100F. It's just permanently attached. Even the lens cap fits like a glove with a friction fit. No springs and popping to get it just right. You just line it up on the front, press it on, and you're good. It's a good tight tolerance like seemingly everything else on the camera. Now for handling and operation. The handling of the X100F is so incredibly tangible. I don't feel like I'm using a computer. I feel like I'm using a camera, and that's a truly important distinction to me. I think Fuji's doing it right with mirrorless. When I've used Sony mirrorless, it felt like a computer, which is fine, but just different. My older but still mighty Nikon V1 is sort of in the middle, but it does feel very electronic. Modern DSLRs have sort of their own analog digital hybrid feel, but the configuration and the complication can take me out of the moment rather than bring me further in. Let's look again at the top of the Fuji. Set a shutter speed, set an aperture, and you're shooting in manual mode. There's not an M anywhere on here. Set the shutter speed to A, that means you are in aperture priority. With that shutter dial in A, then set the aperture dial to A, and you're effectively in program mode. But there's no letter P. This is like a standard transmission in a vehicle. You're telling the camera what to do and how to think, but you're doing it in a very tangible way. Don't get me wrong, this camera works fine on autopilot, but I've got to admit, there's nothing like setting the aperture on the lens itself to get the look that you want from shot to shot. I can take it from f2 to f8 with my eyes closed. As you're using it, the camera just seems to kind of pull you in. Specifications like sensor size just kind of fade away. I became so unconcerned with the technical details and nuanced settings while I was using this camera. So many times I've just selected a film simulation for the day and set the shutter speed on A so I'm in aperture priority, and I fire it away, just not concerned about any detailed settings or really anything except for the aperture ring and composition. That's not to say that you can't shoot a DSLR or other cameras in a very non-complicated fashion, but the tangibility of the controls of the X100F It just brings it all together to where you and the camera are kind of working on the same team. You're calling the shots and the camera is just kind of quickly responding to your whims. I don't know. You know what's happening when you adjust the settings and why with that satisfying click with each adjustment. There are so many options in the camera geared towards making the X100F truly feel like an analog camera in the modern digital world. You can have a digital focusing overlay in the optical viewfinder. You can actually have a split image focusing mode, which is digital, but you can call it up while primarily using the analog viewfinder. Or you can switch to the digital viewfinder, which I must admit is incredible. If you're set up to manually focus, you can use the focus ring as sort of a digital teleconverter. Now let me be clear, this lens is a fixed focal length, but when you want to change composition a bit, you can effectively do a crop on the fly to a 50mm or 70mm focal length. Again, this is digital zoom that is active on JPEG only, but I do like that it's simply the default non-zoomed 35mm, then a step to 50, and then another jump to a 70mm equivalent. It's not a feature that's going to change your life, but it's a simple and very elegant approach, and I found myself using it, I don't know, half a dozen times. With the film simulation modes, it's inviting you to do less at the computer later and set things in the camera the way you want them now. I mean, that's how it used to be. You got the look of the film you were shooting. And if you decided you wanted color after shooting with black and white film, well, you had to go back to where you were. Now, all of that said, if you're shooting raw, you can have your cake and eat it too. I have to admit though, I got kind of a thrill out of shooting JPEG only in one film simulation or another and dealing with the fact that I really wasn't going to be able to change my mind later. Does working with a camera like that help keep me in the moment? Yeah, it kind of does. When I'm shooting that way, I'm not thinking ahead to what I'm going to change on the computer later on. This was the first time in a long time that I was excited to look at the photos later on. When I'm shooting with a DSLR with those giant raw images, sometimes I'm thinking, just get the data, make it great later. Now, as I said, you can certainly shoot raw on the X100F, but I still found it just kind of begging me to stick with the film simulation and not even review the images on the back of the camera and get that same feeling that I used to get when I picked up my film prints from the lab. One thing I like about the film simulations, it works with video. There's an app called Fujifilm Camera Remote, which does work with the X100F with control of the camera, image review, and the ability to save images to your phone. How much time did I spend with the app? Not much. I was busy shooting with the camera itself. But will I do a video walkthrough of the app? Sure. One more software item is both unusual and clever, is Fujifilm's RAW editing software. It's designed to do RAW to JPEG conversions using your computer to control the same parameters that you can control on the camera, but you get to preview the changes on your nice big computer screen. And here's the interesting part. When you're using the software, you actually hook the camera to the computer, not to transfer the images, but the camera itself actually performs the RAW conversion based on the parameters that you've set on the computer. What that means is that the same exact engine in the camera that is capturing raw images and creating the visual renderings of them, that is how you're converting the raw images later on your computer. Same hardware and the same software. Not a software vendor's secondhand interpretation of how those conversions should be handled. To be clear, with the RAW conversion software, it's not like it's rivaling Lightroom or Photoshop or anything like that, but it's smart about all of the functions in the camera for RAW conversions, including selecting the various film simulation modes. Folks, this review is only scratching the surface, but I wanted to share as much about the X100F as quickly as I could. To be a little dramatic for a second, it's kind of changing the way I've been approaching my photography, and I like it. For me, it's important to continually get myself out of my comfort zone. Let's take, for example, my Nikon collection. I've always got ready access to the body I want to shoot with and the lens or lenses that I want. I just drop them right in my bag. Frankly, I thought the X100F might make an occasional guest appearance when the circumstances kind of felt right. But fast forward to a couple of months with this gem, and somehow the circumstances almost always feel right to bring the X100F, and often no other camera. It's kind of scary for me to even say that out loud, but it really has truly been happening. It's the fascinating combination of high quality imaging that rivals anything else out there, along with the controls that bring you fully into the process while keeping everything simple. Fujifilm has been pursuing this sort of analog digital piece of the market for years now, and I truly feel like they've hit their stride with it. They have a strong focus on continuous improvement, and it truly shows in what they've accomplished with this camera. Their passion is evident, or they could never have produced something like this, where the features and the functions are so well geared to help you do that one thing really well, capturing great images with the least distraction while giving you full creative control. Now here's your chance to take creative control. I will be producing many more videos about this camera and digging into more of the details. Tell me in the comments below about the different aspects of this camera that you are interested in learning more about, and I will be sure to include those in follow-up videos, and then maybe some more general Q&A videos with your more general questions about this guy. Don't be shy, fire away, and I will be here to let you know my thoughts.